African Literature. The panel's been introduced, so I don't have to do that. As you can see, we are constrained by our duties up here. Nanekwe is usually a really great photographer, but since she's on stage, it will be up to you to take photographs and gossip for her. I'm just letting you know that. So welcome. Should I welcome you guys to Ake Festival? So you have to make some noise, okay? So welcome to the final panel of Ake Festival. Make some noise. All right, so we're talking about the journey of African literature, which we are, the disputed starting points. And what's interesting, even though that probably, isn't evident, because when you're doing a panel, you have to find threads that link things. All of your books, including yours, which is your professorial rather than your fictional work, have journeys in them, right? So, but they're all journeys that end up being greater than we imagined at the beginning. With you, Nanekwe, in the beginning of your book, the protagonist thinks she's going to see an aunt in London and ends up in Ghana, in boarding school for messing with a boy who will spoil her. With Jennifer, the protagonist wakes up thinking that he's going to be asked some questions about a TV and the stereo, and finds that the journey actually leads to death. And Mukoma, you begin with the question of especially in the Anglophone world, the way that we look at the journey of African literature, starting with the post-Makerere generation and questioning why we don't consider the literatures or the books that came before that, amongst them Amos Tuchola's Palm Wine Drinkard, literature in Hausa, and also in South African languages. And actually, once we begin to look at that journey, we can start asking the question of, what else before that? Because when we look at the journey of European literature, and often we're told about the Iliad, but that lived for many years in kind of oral. It was saved in the oral space before it was transcribed. Now, how do new ideas affect the way it was transcribed? So is it actually the first version or the best version of it? So in any case, what we'll be discussing today is, what we look at in terms of African literature. So I guess for each of you, what would you consider your starting point in the journey for African literature, or the journey of African literature? You can start wherever you want to start.
So for me, it's a good way to think about it as a journey, right? Because I feel by us having ignored, and we can talk about that later, the reasons why we have ignored, early African writing in African languages, and also having ignored Amharic literature, which most of it is not in translation, right? So if you consider how, for example, Amharic literature begins in the 1200s, right? And then you consider Afro-Arab literature that actually could go back to the 500s, right? So my question is, has now become, especially for us as writers, right? What has it done to our imagination, right? To begin the journey halfway, right? It's as if we just got dropped somewhere and then we just kept walking. Right, so I feel there's a loss that we suffer that we haven't yet accounted for, because we don't have a full link. Our imaginations are not fully linked to all of our literatures, right? So it's as if, it's like going to a boxing ring with one arm, one arm tied behind your back. So I don't know. I'm thinking now as a writer that I think that has been my main frustration, feeling cheated out of my own literary tradition.
I think that African literature is suffering from the same sort of anxiety that African culture, African identity is suffering from. This idea that we started with slavery, or we started with colonialism, and there is I think what we're trying to do here, and what we have been doing, is really interrogating, like, where does our history and where does our culture really begin? But in the sort of span of history, those moments were sort of just blips. We come from, your book, covers some of that, Jennifer. But I think when I think of African literature, the way I was introduced to it was that, African storytelling was oral. And just even in preparing for this panel, I was shocked to find out that, as you're mentioning, Mukuma, that our literature dates so far back to 3000 BC, and I'm assuming long before that. So I just think that in terms of where does the journey begin, I think the journey begins in just kind of breaking out of this idea that we started, when colonialism happened, or we started with slavery, and just kind of really looking way, way back.
In my case, I was lucky, or perhaps unlucky, that in Uganda, when I was doing my first degree, when we were doing African literature, the first thing we did was oral tradition. I mean, we had a whole course, and we started with a creationist myth. We studied the legends, and we studied the folk tales as well, and other forms. And this located me straight away in oral traditions. And if you notice, my book is called Chintu, and Chintu is the first man on earth. And that comes out of Bantu, okay? And so for me, having studied literature and having taught it, I could not place myself anywhere else. And I was quite proud to locate myself in that very first creationist myth that my ancestors decided we are human, and this is where we came from. And I thought that that's where my creativity would start. And I think my literature starts there.
Okay, I'm very impressed, Nanekia, to hear that you prepared for the panel with such gusto. But, for those of us who like a book to buy, beyond the oral, is there a book that you would situate, that you could mention that was your first contact with African literature as published the way we know it? So the same question I asked you, but just situate it in a book, rather than, theory is nice, but a book can be bought.
Yeah, so so the first thing I would say is really let's look at the early South African writers, right? Because we tend to dismiss them, right? If you look at a person like Saul Plage, Muhudi, A.C. Jordan, Ancestors of Wrath, and so on and so forth, they weren't just one-off writers, right? It wasn't just what, they didn't just write one book. They were a movement, right? And they were a movement that was political, that was worldly. For example, Saul Plage had left South Africa, went to the U.S., met up with Du Bois, at some point met up with Garvey. Right, this is the same group. If you like the song, the national anthem, right? They're the same guys who composed this. They're the originators of the ANC.
Mukoma, just one question. Oh. Are you avoiding the question because the first book you read? Wait, because the first book you read wasn't your father's book?
No. I was going to preface all that and then say, books like Things Fall Apart, of course. The River Between, which I had to study. I was taken as the expert, in school. So definitely the whole Heinemann, writer series, But now I think of it with great disappointment, actually. Okay. You don't know why? Okay.
Well, you're going to talk about Swahili, probably.
No.
But carry on. Okay.
I think my first novel. And now this is difficult because there was a novel that was read to me as a child. Is that?
Yeah, that's fine.
It was in Luganda. It was called Basajja Mivule. It was published around the 1920s.
Okay, beautiful.
There are three answers to that question for me. I remember, so I grew up in New York, and I remember my father having a copy of The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. But he never read it to me, and I remember just seeing it in our, on our bookshelf. And then when I went to school in Ghana, I think we read, I took English, and so we read several different books. And I remember Mine Boy by Peter Abraham.
Yes,
but I liked that book, but I didn't connect with it. The first I would say the book that sort of like broke me open and made me understand the kind of writer that I aspire to be was Buchi Emecheta's The Joys of Motherhood.
Okay.
That book
Wonderful.
was the first book that I said, aha, I get it. I get what this African story is about and how I want, and not to say that this is the sort of like monolithic African story, but I get what she was doing, and that's what I want to do.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful.
Can we add others? You know, I feel like I should do a full confession and also say I read things like James Hadley Chase, Mill and Boone.
So did I.
And so forth. Yeah.
I was asking about your first contact with African literature,
okay,
not the side chicks. So no, but I mean, Mukoma, I can see you're trying to take us back, and I chime with you on that because there's a book that my former colleague at Cal State LA, Laurie Ramey, edited called Every Goodbye Ain't Gone. It's an anthology of innovative poetry from African America, and in the critical preface to that, she says that you cannot understand the American poetic tradition if you're going to exclude work songs. So there's a kind of schizophrenia in the way that America tries to kind of write about its poetics because those things are not kind of acknowledged. And in the same way, perhaps some of the confusions we have about African writing right now is because we don't think about those old texts. Even Onitsha literature, and a lot of our starting point is situated in this kind of post-colonial people who were educated in a certain way. So almost their literature is almost reactive. And that's why I think in the Anglophone world, we probably have work that is considered to be highly politicized and less of the fun kind of writing that we have. So I'm really interested in your exploration of the history, but I'm also really taken by what you just told me about, you know, studying and starting in the oral tradition, because I think that probably should happen a lot more. So in terms, I mean, we are where we are. What do you think can happen from now, and what will those things do to enhance the journey forward for African literature?
Yeah, so I've come up with a slogan that says the future of African literature is actually in its past, right? Sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, I'm still working on the slogan. You know, but that is to say that we can't. I don't think we can carry on. Really, you know, and this is something that happened to me once I discovered this other literature. I don't think we can carry on as writers if we don't attend to those texts, right? You know, somebody in another panel used the idea of having a truncated imagination. So that's one. We need to go back to that literature. I think we really need to think about translation, because there's so much literature locked in African languages, right? I mentioned Amharic literature, right? You know, it's only now that, you know, one or two books have been translated. So there's all this knowledge and wealth and aesthetics that's locked away in in literature in African languages that we just don't attend to. So I would say I would center translation. I would definitely center translation.
In Uganda, we have this weird thing. So for us, of course, the first novels were in Luganda, and they were between 1920s and perhaps up to the 40s. There were a lot of published books in Luganda. And what is happening is that Luganda is being taught in schools, and you can do Luganda literature. That includes Things Fall Apart, which is Byonna Sika in Luganda. It includes Animal Farm, which is Bawansolo. So, but those are the texts we get from abroad. The rest of the texts are from Uganda. So you do your O-levels in Luganda, you do your A-levels, and you do a first degree in Luganda, and you can do a PhD in Luganda literature. But what is going on? Those are the literature in English and literature in Uganda are not related at all because of lack of translation. So now that I'm older, I can see that many of the books that my grandfather read to me in Luganda are so close to Amos Tutuola's, you know, this man on a journey of quest. But if there wasn't Luganda classes, they would be out of print now. But still, those people who do them are so separate from us. So I'll agree with you that for us to map this journey, we need those early texts to be translated, or maybe we need English texts to be translated in Luganda, but we need those early texts, which are dotted around Africa. I'm sure they're everywhere. And so that then people like you who are interested in this journey, we can see how the novel has developed.
I just want to add that I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in is expanding the definition of what we mean by African, because I think that the journey, going back to this colonialism and slavery, the journey went to America. And so for me, African American literature was my first exposure to sort of beginning to develop like a Black consciousness that then led me to say, okay, I'm connecting with some of this, but this isn't everything, which then led me to start looking for African books by African authors, Caribbean authors as well. I think that it's important that we accept and we admit that those are also part of the African literary tradition. And what does that mean? Like, how do we make the tent big enough so that when we are talking about these issues of translation or speaking to one another, and then, I mean, we got to talk about like the Francophone and the Lusophone and the Anglophone, and how, you know, there's a whole tradition of people that are reading Francophone books that Anglophones have never even heard of those authors. So I think we need to kind of expand, we need to speak to one another and also expand our borders to really kind of accept that the African story has also migrated.
Can I, before you move on?
Yeah, go on. Well, I'm not moving on, but carry on.
Talking about expansion, expanding African literature, this has been itching me, asking Mukoma. You know,
he's out of a job.
Hey.
You know how we talk about African literature, and how we are talking about it now. Yeah. There's a sense that, for me, that we are talking about the novel. But African literature is wide, as you can imagine. There are 3 forms, and those forms are very elastic. So you have prose, you have drama, and you have poetry.
And praise songs.
What I've found is that when we talk about African literature, especially when you talk about language issue, we tend to think that the whole of literature is the novel. And what I've found is that, for example, in Uganda, our biggest literary production, and this is the literary production that takes care of the nation, because every nation needs does this literary consumption. But the largest production of literature is drama. And because drama did not come with Europe, it is an indigenous form, it's been produced consistently in our traditional languages. So our literary production in Uganda is 98% drama, and then poetry, and the tiny 0.01 is the novel. So basically, the major literary production is in our indigenous languages. So whenever people talk about what is the journey of African literature, I'm wondering, are we going to talk about drama, which is our languages, and poetry?
It's a very good point. And I mean, obviously, your father first got into trouble for a play.
So in his case, it was he could be as radical as he wanted in English, right? He could be as radical as he wanted in English, but it's only when he started writing in Gikoyo, and especially when he started doing Gahika Dead Almari, When I Want the Play, that he was finally thrown in jail, right? You know, because finally he was in direct communication with the, you know, with his audience, right? You know, but it's a great question though. Yeah, why do we put so much high premium on the novel? And part of it is that we inherited and accepted, and some of it was forced as well. You know, the literary aesthetics that, you know, European or the colonizers, you know, standards of aesthetics, right? So they put a high premium on the novel, and then we put a high premium on the novel. Then you also have to think about how African literature was manufactured, right? Or then you'd have to go back to the Heinemann series. You'd have to look at the education of publishing, profit. But deep down, I believe that we have just accepted the European aesthetic of what is good. You know, and going back to what you were saying, Nana, what you were saying earlier, why look at the ways in which we have fenced in African literature, right? We have fenced it in around English, around the novel. You know, and I'm thinking this because I'm going back to Chinua Achebe when he said, in the essay, The African Writer and I, or something like that, he ends with, I have a plea, please don't fence me in. But that's precisely what we have done, because it's been the most productive, the most profitable, you know, and also the most aesthetically, the novel being the most thing we have aesthetically wedded to, right?
So, I mean, if I can read from that, you know, you're almost saying that the idea of African literature at the moment is almost like a commodity, and it is leaning towards the novel. So maybe part of the job is to kind of sort of make more complex that definition in the production and also in the definitions. I mean, I totally take your point about African American literature, because if we look at the entire Caribbean and African American, you know, tales from Africa survived and influenced the way that they tell stories. So it is part of the story. But I mean, also then I want to ask, you know, then the question arises, is consciousness of blackness necessary for the production of an African novel? Because actually, sometimes on the continent, that consciousness of I am black doesn't exist. And that might be one of the things that we can give to the world. So, you know, I mean, obviously, all I'm saying is, you know, we should be looking at it as a range and not like this is one way, this is the way to go. Because I feel personally like I survived the West because I didn't spend the first few years of my life thinking of myself as black, right? And that armor is also underpins, you know, my work. But also, if you look at, if we talk about commodities and how things are sold, you write in your book about how Amos Tutuola's palm wine drinker, Faber were looked at it as an exotic thing, but also what they were saying is that it's alien, terrifying, and superstitious, and you can see some of the perpetration of that in even the design of book covers, you know, and so I guess what I'm saying is, if the production of literature is outside of Africa, we're always going to have certain problems which then affect the journey going forward. So, you know, you've started the prize in Kiswahili. The various, you know, initiatives. This festival is one of the things that brings literature back to the heart of the African community, right? So within this journey, what are the other things that we can do, taking into account all these other complications that have happened because of what history does, to make sure that the journey forward is interesting and good and fun? I mean, because this is one of my gripes with, I mean, I think Francophone literature helps us a little bit, so translation is certainly one of the things. One of my gripes with Anglophone African literature is that sometimes it's moving forward with this game face on so much that you can't even, you know, relax around it. Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Sorry for using game face in public.
Just to go back to Jennifer's question and intervention as well. Let's also face it, is that these questions exist for the intellectual, right? You know, because everybody else is they're using African languages, you know, there are newspapers in African languages, plays and so on and so forth, songs. So it's only us, you know, who have this question. But then we are also the only ones with you know, with the cultural capital and the power, right? You know, joining you know, the intelligentsia and so on and so forth. Yeah.
But also, we have these questions, because the product we have is produced in a European language, and therefore it flows beyond the borders where it is produced. So right now, if you thought about Ugandan playwrights, if you collected them, they would fill this hotel. There are so many. And they are really not bothered about where African literature is going, okay? Because, you know, for them, they are consumed by the daily, by their society, you know? And they cater for those immediate needs, okay? But because the novel came, the way we are handling it, arrived from Europe, and it arrived with certain characters. It keeps on moving between nations and going back home where it came from, and sometimes we are following it back where it came from. And so, in a way, it almost slips out of our hands. So when, for example, I have my book published in Europe, there's a certain way they're going to tell me, this is the way the novel works, this is what we expect, this is, and as long as we are letting it slip back to where it came from, we really don't have much control of the African novel.
I think it also comes down to, I mean, you mentioned like some of the infrastructure, like when you have a festival like this that is, you know, has, you know, the market for the kinds of books that we're selling, it gives you more leverage to say like, this is the audience here and this is what they want to read. But there's so many sort of moving parts. You need editors. Like some of us were talking earlier today about the epiphany of working with an editor that actually knows what the hell you're talking about, and you know can question you. I wrote a short story recently about an MP. And my editor was asking, hey, is this MP not married? Because the MP must be married, even though he's, you know, doing whatever he's doing. And it made me laugh because, you know, only an African editor would have the sort of like eye to note that like, okay, the minister must be, you know, this big man has a wife and the wife would never want him to be alone with this woman. So I think that's something that we really need to kind of dig into as well, creating a real sort of infrastructure around the work that we're doing so that we're not so dependent on, you know, the way Europeans or Americans want to frame it.
Can I piggyback on that as well? You know, because
make it quick.
We're talking about structure.
I've started seeing signs around the room.
because when you're talking about infrastructure and structures, I hadn't realized how absent they were for African languages until me and Lizzie Atri, formerly with the Kane Prize, we started the Kiswahili Prize, right? And that's when we started, you know, thinking about this. Kiswahili is spoken by 120 million people or more, right? And yet there are only 2 literary prizes for that, as far as I know, right? But Kiswahili has the support of the Tanzanian government. It's been adopted by, you know, now South Africa as well has, you know, adopted Kiswahili, right? But think about the other languages. For example, in my own language, Gikuyu, there are no literary journals, no literary prizes. Suddenly very hard to get published. You know, even my father who writes in Gikuyu, it has problems getting published in Gikuyu, right? So I think if you're talking about the structures and the future of African literature, it would also be setting up the structures for African languages, but then also structures for all writing, right? Okay, just briefly. Okay, consider this. We have how many countries? 54 countries, right? 54.
Yes.
Okay, how many festivals can you name? How many journals, literary journals, can you name? How many literary prizes can you name? And we are talking about a population of almost 1 billion people, right?
Yeah.
So there's urgent work to be done in terms of the structures.
I mean, I guess then the question becomes, you know, the situation is what it is. But then there are things that are new, right? So technology is one of those things. How do we use technology to kind of move forward? So we just talked about how Homer was, the Iliad was carried orally for ages. Sometimes the infrastructure is not in place to put these things in print, but actually we can audio record and archive and transcribe later, as long as we don't lose the languages in the interim. You know, so you know the possibilities with, but also then we have to think about preparing the readers for the text. And so I want to ask you, this will be my final question before I open to the floor. what you feel the role of children's literature is in all of this. Because actually, if we don't produce enough for children to read, by the time they get to the point where they're reading you know, the kind of the norms that they have kind of encoded within their minds as to how they read will have been shaped by some other literature or some other stories. So, you know, I mean, when I published a children's book last year, and the political battles I had to have with my editors to maintain certain things, they were asking me to explain why somebody had a long name. And I wrote back to say if they would allow me to explain why Europeans had short names like John, I would also write an explanation. And then they didn't answer back after that and allowed me to keep the long names. But, you know, it's that kind of thing where if a child is reading and they're always the other, then they learn to read as the other. So, you know, what do you think the place of literature for children is? And, you know, how do we make sure that you know, is part of the journey, an essential part of the journey, because the start must be the start, right?
I think that goes back to the infrastructure. I think it's the same issue because it's the same literary apparatus that is constraining the movement of the story in adult literature as well. I actually think, though, that in children's, at least in children's entertainment, there seems to be a lot more of a hyper dedication to diversity. So, you know, you have things like Dora the Explorer, and you have, I mean, there seems to be more, what was that? There seems to be more of...
No, I mean, I was doing that because it's diversity, but it's in a very particular context, you know?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that there's in a way, it's sort of like, we must represent each person in the category. And, you know, I guess we're telling children that, I don't know, that everywhere you go, there will always be one of you everywhere. But I think that it's the same issues.
I think because I'm thinking about children in Africa reading African writers, perhaps published on the continent. I think one of the problems is that, and perhaps it's more so now, the generations from the 80s, the intervention of the TV and the cartoon, and parents leaving TV to bring up their children in terms of storytelling and story consumption, which used to be parents telling stories, and then from stories to reading, you know, stories written from, you know, from the same place. But at the same time, while we can push that and children are brought up reading, also grown-ups are not reading, you know. And for me, as a writer, I'm producing a product, and I would like it consumed. And I would like to see, you know, a movement to awaken the readers, because I believe the readers are here. The James Hadley Chase readers, who are now, that is so out of no one reads James Hadley Chase anymore. I think they are reading Dan Brown and all those people. And that is the commodity I'm competing. Chintu is competing against those. And there's a belief among young and uninformed readers that Dan Brown, because it was written by a white person and he has made a lot of money, is better than a book with an author who has a similar name to them. So there is a need for us, I think, to start reawakening the market and producing good books that compete with the books they are reading at the moment.
Yeah, actually somebody, I think, posted something on Instagram where they were saying that they went to an airport, it could have been in South Africa, they went to the bookstore and there was this small section for African literature. Right, you know, so in an African bookstore, you just find a small section for African literature. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in the question of writing for children. I made a foray into it. came up with this brilliant idea of writing a few poems that parents could read to their children in the morning. That didn't go very far, because it turns out nobody has time in the morning to read, to read poetry. But for me, it's also a very personal question. You know, I have an 8-year-old. We live in the U.S. You know, and I thought, you know, one of the gifts I could give her was the gift of my language, right? You know, so I speak to her in Gikuyu. But in going through that journey, then also realize how little. In fact, there are very, very few children's books in Gikuyu, right, and for other African languages. So, and you're competing against English, right? And English has all these resources from the TV, you know, Dorex, the Explorer. It has all these other resources that African languages don't have. So I don't know. It's very difficult writing for children. I've found, right? You know, but I do think that's something we should all consider as writers.
A challenge to you all. I will now open the floor to those of you who are the reason we're here, the audience, and I think there will be a mic to go around. So if anybody has a question, please put your hand up. We may not have the answers, but we'll try.
No, all the answers are in my book.
Oh yes, actually, I was delivered this package so that you could actually see the books that are here. Where's the microphone? Okay.
Hello. Thank you for such an interesting discussion. Oh, stand, okay. Hello. Often when there are conversations about the health of the novel, not just the African novel, but the novel in general, people talk about formal invention being something that's really important, writers feeling compelled to kind of experiment with the form of the novel. I wondered whether you could talk to us about any African writers that you think are doing interesting things with the form of the novel. Thanks.
I mean, I can give you a scholarly take, you know, which is, you know, so what I've found is that, and this is going through, the early South African literature, right? The early South African literature was, you know, the literature of travel, the literature of journey, right? You know, mostly about synthesis, about melding, you know, African cultures and European cultures, right? You know, so I call it the novel of synthesis. Then you get to the Makerere generation, the Chinua Achebe generation. They produce a literature of decolonization, right? Most of it is about decolonization. Then what is interesting to me is when you come now to my generation, right? Whereas for the Makerere generation, the world made sense, even in the colonial, you know, in the sense of what Fanon calls the Manichean world, right? You have the colonizer, you have the colonized. Of course, it turns out it wasn't that easy, right? You know, but they had the colonizer, they had the colonized. For our generation, things are more complex, right? We don't have. Just to give you an example, you know, and this example I give a lot, which is of, you know, at some point in Kenya it was illegal to dream of the president's death, right? You know, or you know, you're sometimes to gather more than 5 people, you have to look for a permit and so on and so forth, right? So to capture the neo-colonial, globalized Africa, right? Then I think, by definition, novelists have had to do different things, you know. So if you look at most of the novels, they either have multiple narrators, you know, just to try to capture all that, right? They are fractured. If you look at We Need New Names, for example, or Helon Habila's Waiting for an Angel, there's this whole literature that's coming out now that in trying to capture this, I don't know, just this weird space that makes sense at little expense. Huh?
Her book.
Well, she'll okay.
No. I'm saying her book as well. I'm adding it to your list. Carry on.
Yeah. So you can look at form. Maybe you could look at form and the material basis of form, right? And for us, it would be a globalized world that doesn't make sense.
I was just looking up because I remember coming across a woman, her name I think was Zola, and she wrote a story on Twitter about, did anyone read it? I saw some faces, heads nodding, and it was about strippers and pimps. And it was, I forget how many tweets it was, but it was a full story, beginning, middle, and end, and it was super, super compelling. And I think she ended up getting a deal out of it. And then there was someone else that, this gentleman, I don't believe, was African, but he started a Twitter feed called Shit My Dad Says, And it ended up, it was so compelling that it ended up becoming a sitcom. The sitcom I don't think did very well. I don't think it was good. But I think that people are experimenting with different forms. I myself have been experimenting with like Insta stories and doing like just sort of like micro chapters on Instagram through stories. And that's been really interesting, and I've gotten really good feedback on it. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity with technology, with social media, to kind of explode the form and the format, because I do think that people are reading, but what's happening is that for better or for worse, most of us are on our phones, and we're consuming everything there, from articles to, you know, people's lives on Instagram. And I think that there's some really interesting ways that we can sort of explode what it means to be a novelist using some of these forms.
And I think just on this panel, there's been, in this festival, there have been a few Afrofuturism panels already. I saw, did you want to add to that?
I wanted to expand on what you said. So the novels that now are being pointed out as experimenting with form, we need new names. No Violet. No Violet writes this book that is in chapters, but the chapters are almost complete in themselves, and there's no major thread going through as a, you know, as a conflict. And there was a lot of confusion in the West about it, and what is going on? We're used to this, you know. And then my novel came out, and it had 6 main characters, and each one of them has a book. And there are so many names. And oh my God, who can remember these names? And do they meet again? Oh, what is going on here? And before they could set on that, the Ghanaian book about the Yajasi came out, and it was inflicted on the world as well. And it's doing exactly the same. But I'm telling you, I know Violet and Yajasi, we had never met, okay? But for some reason, 3 African women, and I suspect there are more people, have been playing with form in the same way. I don't know why that happened, and I hadn't noticed until somebody said, no, these are not novels. We need a new name for these novels, and they're coming out of Africa.
Pun intended. Yeah.
And I'd add to that Chuma and Wokolo's The Extinction of Menai, which is a true mind blower. Has anyone read it in this room? Okay, you all need to go. He's from Nigeria too. I'm very ashamed of you. We had a question right here in the front.
Yeah. Hello. So yesterday we watched a documentary about traditionalists here in the film room, and one of those featured in the film made a comment about how their tradition is mostly oral, and they do not document. They just pass it on from one generation to the next, and that made me think about how when something is being passed on orally, there's that element of it that gets lost, especially throughout history, and it's striking because as centuries pass, so much of it has been lost, and wanted to ask, pardon my ignorance, so like the Arabs have all this literature that dates back centuries, and the Westerners do we have that sort of documentation from Africa?
Yes. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the panel, but there are ancient Coptic texts, ancient Egyptian texts, ancient Liberian texts, ancient. I'm sorry.
Amorite from
exactly. There are lots of ancient texts that were written, so they exist. And then and I think that the myth has been that all we have is oral storytelling. But to your question about things being lost over time, griots are actually trained in such a way that they are preserving the story as much as faithfully as they can. I mean, maybe one of the other panelists can speak to this with more expertise, but from what I understand, griots are not just sort of like, it's not a telephone game, you know?
Yeah, but you know what? That loss is also gain. So when you have been told your story by your grandmother, and you rather your mother, and you pass it on to your child, you're going to tell that story in a context. The world has changed. Your child sees the world differently. So you're going to tell the story differently. So where once upon a time there were flying humans, you might change it into something else. And that is what preserves that story. So the loss that you're talking about could also be a gain, and that is what sustains it. And that's what keeps it entertaining. Because sometimes these stories that are so static, you know, because of fact, which fact we are not really sure is a fact because we were not there. So, you know, when stories are given life by storytelling, they are made to live longer.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, it would be interesting to find out how many African languages don't have a Bible in an African language, right? You know, because most of the missionaries translated the Bible into African languages, right? You know, so, and it's possible to build on that. But I was saying this earlier, right? The amount of loss, right? The amount of loss that exists because we don't imaginatively, we are not in tune with the literatures in African languages, right? For example, Amharic, for example, right? You have this literature that dates to the 1200s that has barely been translated, right? The Timbuktu manuscripts, right? Haven't been, the translation is still in the process. But even then, African governments had to wait until, I think it's a Western university that's doing that, right? So there are ways in which, even the book that I know that was translated from Amharic about this beautiful, you know, it's a beautiful story about a saint called Petros, right? Even that had to be translated by a Western, right? You know, so I don't know. Quite frankly, a part of me just doesn't understand what we're doing, right? you know. Yes, I study this stuff, but at some point it just breaks down for me because I can't understand how, you know, for generations we can allow this knowledge to remain locked away, right? And it's our heritage. It's ours. It's ours to work with our imaginations and also to, you know, to be accessible to everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Any other questions? We may end up being the first panel to finish early. I have nothing against that, especially since I'm on here with a few other great people. Not that I'm great. Doing some poetry later.
Yeah, but maybe for a minute we can talk about the interesting stuff that the younger people are doing, right? You know, there is. I'm thinking of. Are you guys familiar with Jalada, right?
Jalada Collective,
yeah. Which actually, you know, they took a story written by Goge, originally written in Gikoyo. Then they have translated it into, I think, over 70 languages now, of which the majority, over 40 or so, are African languages, right? Which raises the question of translating between African languages. But then they do something else, which is they have those stories read, right? So if you go to if you just Google Jalada, right, and you'll see the stories exist online in oral form and also in translated form, right? You know, so again, meeting orature and you know, and cyber, you know, and the cyber
and archiving in two forms,
Yeah, I think the younger generation is rather fearless. They are, I mean, sometimes they make me feel like our generation has been just lazy, you know, just sitting there and waiting things to be done for us. But when you look further down in East Africa, all the festivals, you know, festival initiatives have been started by young people in their 20s and early 30s who are fearlessly, you know, I don't know where they get the money from, but they collect people together and say we are bringing authors and we are bringing books, and things don't go very well, but they are fearless, you know, and I think this is the future of African writing.
You know, and I'm still trying to understand this for myself because they don't seem to have inherited the same language anxieties that my generation, for example, inherited, right? It could be that maybe my generation born in the 70s, we are closer to colonialism. But they don't have, they don't have, you know, when I was growing up, we had to sit down and practice how to pronounce English. I had to be taught, you know, how to say, she sells seashells at the seashore, because how I pronounce English mattered for my very own social life, or even my dating life, right? You know, no, seriously, yeah, if you couldn't say your L and R, so no matter how good looking you are.
Our parents were more colonial.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Yeah. So they're very interesting that for them, they haven't, I don't know how, but they don't have that.
We are not colonial. We are their parents.
Oh, okay, true that, yeah, on the other hand, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it was, we weren't allowed to speak our languages in school. I haven't detected that as much anymore in Ghana, but I'm quite sure there's still some schools that do it. But all of these things play into it because it creates a hierarchy, a sense of hierarchy in languages where this is the language that you're supposed to speak in decent company and that kind of thing, which then affects whether or not people choose to write in those languages or read those languages. So again, it's a dynamic that, I mean, you know, there's the one thing that we haven't mentioned in here. In much of this, a lot could be facilitated by our governments who have neglected their duty over many, many years. And I make it a point to say this all the time so that eventually somebody in some government will feel some inkling to, they probably won't even do it through government. They'll do it themselves so you can praise them for donating money, but whatever. So, we have a question, another question? Okay. Are there any other people in the room with questions? Because I can take two, and then we'll probably have to be done. Okay. It's either my vision's not good or we just have this. Okay.
My question is to Nana. I just wanted to ask if you have any advice to give to short story writers?
And any general advice to give to a short story writer? Yes, write the story. Write the story. I mean, is there something specific about short story writing that is addling you?
I've only written one. Like, I want to write more, but I haven't been able to come around it. And it always seems a bit longer than it should be, so I don't know. Like.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, trust the process. That's the first thing, like, trust the process. I mean, I think there's something I read a long time ago that has been useful to me, which says that a writer is half doubt and half confidence, right? You know, so, yeah, so maybe that would be useful. But then, you know, for everybody, you know, for all of us, right? The advice has remained true for a very long time, which is read a lot. So read a lot of short stories and write a lot of short stories. Yeah.
And if it reads too long, it's very long. Cut it in half.
I mean, I like that half doubt. It sounds good, but I prefer half man, half amazing. But thank you all very much for being here. Please applaud our panel, Mukoma Wangugi, Jennifer Makumbi, Naneoki Abreu-Hammond, my fellow Ghana woman, and applaud yourselves for being here and contributing to the discussion, and hope to see you back here in a few minutes for the next session. Thank you.